if you're engaged in exercise, you like training hard, and you're covering all your bases around, actually, this is probably a good one to come in on. Welcome back to the Smart Strength Training Podcast. We are on podcast episode 34, and hopefully you're joining this off the back of the last podcast that I did, which was all about supplement as a whole and the tiering system around sport supplementation, which leads nicely into the next obvious thing, which is to dive into the specifics of some supplements. And no surprise, we're going to come in on creatine first and make sure that everything that you need to know about creatine I cover off in this podcast episode. I guess the first question is like, what is creatine? But to really answer that, we have to think about energy, how the body uses energy. If I was just to go down to the street and ask random people, like, what energy does the body use? How do we move? What do we that we eat does the body burn for energy? I think most people would say carbohydrates and fat, and that is absolutely right. But actually, at a molecular level, the muscle contractions are fueled by ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is the energy currency that your body deals in. And then we have different energy pathways in which ATP can be produced via fat or carbohydrates. So let's just talk about it a little bit so you understand these pathways. So first up, fat. So we primarily convert fat via beta oxidation. This is slow and efficient, and we produce more ATP molecules than carbohydrates do with fat, and it requires oxygen. But the key here is that it's slow. It's not a process that can happen rapidly, so it's fine for anything that's not high intensity, a hard bout of exercise. So me sat here, my body is quite happily utilizing that pathway of beta oxidation to convert fat into ATP. Then carbohydrates. There's two different pathways that we can convert carbohydrates, glycogen, into ATP. The first is glycolysis and the other is oxidative phosphorylation. So these processes take time and they involve multiple enzymes or enzymatic steps to go through. And they can be done either anaerobically or aerobically, with or without oxygen. ATP production in the mitochondria, the aerobic form or the anaerobic form, is actually through lactate fermentation. It's faster than fat oxidation, and it's the dominant energy system during moderate to high intensity activities. So you can see here, this is super cool. Like when we're doing different types of movements, different types of actions, if you're just walking around, like I said, it's mainly just that beta oxidation. But let's say you run up the stairs quickly or you sprinted for the bus, all of a sudden your body is tapping into different energy systems, and the body is doing this all the time. It's always using different energy systems for different things that you're doing. So it's super cool, right? Just to understand that. So they're also, just to state, that is one of the pathway, which is through ketones, but I'm not going to talk about that too much because that's not the primary pathway. You'd only really be using that if you were following some sort of very low carbohydrate diet. So let's talk a little bit about creatine then, and where does creatine sit into this energy system? So I mentioned ATP. So as the name suggests, adenosine triphosphate. So there's 3 phosphate groups. And the body actually only needs to break one phosphate group to fuel a muscle contraction. And what that does, it takes ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and leaves ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, with the release of that one phosphate group. The body only needs one phosphate group to be released for the right amount of energy, but it also keeps that ADP molecule stable for rapid uptake of one more phosphate group, so the body has that ability to regenerate ATP quickly. And this is where creatine comes in. So creatine monohydrate that you take as your supplement is actually stored in your muscle as creatine phosphate. So that means the creatine phosphate can donate one phosphate group to that ADP to rapidly regenerate ATP, so you have quick, instant access to energy for high intensity bouts of activity. So we can recognize now that these fuel systems, they kick in at different intensities. And if it's really short and sharp, then that ATP CP, so that creatine phosphate, that's the energy system that you're going to be using. There's a limit to how much ATP the body can store. There's a limit to how much phosphocreatine the body can store, and there's a limit to how quickly the body can donate that phosphate group to ADP to be rapidly uptaken to ATP. So you'll notice during high intensity bouts of training, we are really talking about things 10, 12, maybe as long as 17 seconds, but very short, very high intensity. And that's where phosphocreatine really comes into play. Worth stating at this stage, because when I come to sort of some bits at the end, it might make a bit more sense if you've heard it already. But the process of facilitating this rapid uptake requires the enzyme creatine kinase, and this speeds up the transfer of that phosphate group. So it's just important because creatine kinase often comes up in blood markers, and that can be one of the things that people get worried about around kidneys and creatine. But creatine kinase is going to be elevated for those that take creatine, but that does not mean that your inflammatory markers are elevated. But it's really important to understand that we need that enzymatic pathway to be able to transfer that phosphate group over. It's a really important part of the process overall. So by supplementing with creatine monohydrate, we saturate the body's phosphocreatine stores. And by doing so, we can generate ATP quickly so we can maintain the contraction for longer. But also more importantly, we can uptake ATP during those rest periods. So whilst we're resting from a hard bout of a sprint or a hard bout of lifting, we have the ability to regenerate ATP quickly. So it helps both in the workout in that moment in time, whilst you're trying to push hard close to failure, but also to get ATP ready for the next set of what you're doing. So who really benefits from creatine? So really anyone that's doing strength training, any kind of sprint or high intensity interval form of training, power-based training or sports that involve power, so football, rugby, Olympic weightlifting, and really any activity that requires a repeated bout of an high intensity burst, which is lots of things like tennis, even to a degree things like skiing where you have to cut, turn. It's important for so many sports. There's also good research to show that in endurance athletes, it can be beneficial too, because as I mentioned, it's important to state that we're not just using one energy system. The body is going to be using all three energy systems depending on the demands of the particular muscles. So you might have some muscles that are going through an endurance style, like let's say I'm lifting weights and I'm bracing my abs. Well, they're not working like maximally, but if I was lifting a weight really fast, close to failure in my shoulder girdle, then the muscle tissues in my shoulder, they might start to be using the ATP. So recognizing that when we're doing endurance activity, there will still be muscle fibers that are contracting quickly. So we have that need for energy systems to change across the human body all the time. So the reality is if you engage in any form of hard-ish training, I think creatine's a really smart supplementation. I think also at a population level, it's also important to state, because this is super important for my audience. So for women, especially perimenopausal, postmenopausal women, it's probably even more important that they take creatine. Why? Because you may have heard, I've stated it a few times, that anaerobic resistance is something that older adults, especially women going through menopause or postmenopause, are going to have to think about. So it becomes harder for the body to naturally go through the anabolic. Anabolic always sounds terrifying, but anabolic just means a positive state of energy repair or tissue repair. So that anabolic resistance is just a bit harder to generate tissue. So anything that stacks the deck in your favor when it comes to performance and recovery from bouts of training is a really smart thing to think about. So I would strongly advise for older adults as a whole, but especially for women going through menopause, it can be a really smart thing to take. Let's talk brain health, because this has picked up a lot of momentum in the last 18 months. As I said, ATP is the energy currency of the human body. Fun fact, the brain uses approximately 20% of the overall energy your body burns in the day is utilized by your brain. It's a very energy hungry organ. And of course, ATP is the main currency, is the primary currency of energy in the body. So anything that improves ATP replenishment, could help. And it's been really interesting to see some of the studies and potential benefits or cognitive benefits, mood disorders, and it's been used a little bit in concussion recovery as well. Very, very interesting branch of the research. So it's certainly cool to see. With creatine, we know what it does. We know how it works. We know the safety and effectiveness of it. So it's interesting to see in a supplement that there's been a shift now away from the sports side of things and over to other applications to it. There's been some very, very cool findings in the research. It is early days. What I will say is that in the research, you see dosages used significantly higher than the average sort of maintenance dose, which we'll discuss in a second, that people are taking. I've seen lots of influencers sort of jump on this and be like, it's a slam dunk for cognitive function when it comes to creatine. That's really not where the research is sat. The earlier research was probably a bit more promising than some of the more recent research, but it's certainly an interesting element. And it's just one more potential benefit to why it could be a smart idea to start taking creatine or just continue taking creatine. So let's talk about how to take creatine, when to take it, and is it like time dependent? As I mentioned, which I think is what's super important to understand the why behind this kind of stuff. Now you know how it works. If we can saturate our phosphocreatine stores at a muscular level when we are going through these bouts of activity, the body can then replenish ATP quickly. So the aim is to saturate all the phosphocreatine stores in the human body. So it doesn't really matter when you take it because the body is going to do that throughout the course of a day, and we're constantly moving and constantly going between energy systems. So we're using creatine throughout the day. So it's not so much about when you take it, it's more about making sure you take it consistently. So you can take it in the morning, you can take it after training, you can take it in the evening. As long as you remember to take it, that's the most important thing. Don't stress out if you miss a day, nothing bad's gonna happen. Just get back to taking it like you would do normally. There is a little bit of research that shows slight improvements in performance taking creatine directly before a training bout. I said in the last podcast about creatine as a whole, when we're talking about the performance benefits, we're talking about like 2 to 5% increase. So when it comes to taking creatine before a workout, if you get a slight bump on your 2 to 5%, we're talking so minimal, it's barely going to be detectable in your training, and it's certainly hard to state that's going to equal an awful lot as far as long-term gains in strength and muscle tissue. And ultimately, if it's practical to take it before a workout, great, take it before a workout. If it's not practical or it causes GI tract distress, which we'll come to in a second, then you haven't got to do it. You're not going to miss out on anything that's really significant if you're not taking it first thing. You're not taking it directly before your workout. So biggest takeaway on that is it's a daily supplement. Try and take it pretty religiously every single day. So dosages between 3 to 5 grams per day, or you can base it off per pound of body weight, per kilo of body weight, or 0.03 grams per kilo of body weight, which lands most people between that 3 to 5 gram mark. And that's a daily dose. If you miss a day, I wouldn't go taking double the next day. I would just take your daily dose. You'll often see in the back of the packet, the manufacturer will suggest a loading phase where you take 10, 15 grams for 7, 10, up to 14 days. The idea of that is to get to that maximum saturation level as quickly as possible. By all means, you can do that. You don't really need to. Like if you get there 2 weeks quicker, doesn't really matter. It does feel a little bit like a marketing ploy to get people to use it. I would just suggest to go to your daily dose, so 3 to 5 grams, and just be consistent with that. Because let's talk about some of the potential issues with creatine. And the first one's going to be around GI tract distress, gas, and some bloating. Generally, if someone's going to say they have issues with creatine, it's either going to be during a loading phase where they're taking this super high dose it. Potentially, it's if they're not having it with food and they're just having it as a beverage. supposedly because it's not soluble in water, that can cause people some GI tract distress. You can get things like buffered creatine that they market as being more GI tract friendly. It's hard to say that's going to be accurate. I know clients I've worked with have had issues with buffered creatine, and it's a lot more expensive. I would generally suggest if someone's having any kind of GI tract issue when it comes to creatine, I would split the dose. I'd start with a lower dose, so I'd come down to maybe 2 grams or 1 gram, and potentially I'd split the dose between the morning and the afternoon, so you're not taking it all in one hit. I'd have it with a meal. If that doesn't work, like I said, you're not exactly missing out on load. We spoke about a 2 to 5% increase in performance. You can try different types of creatine, like buffer creatine. I wouldn't stress too much. If you just happen to be the sort of person that has a reaction to creatine and you don't seem to digest it well, you've tried a few different versions, you've tried splitting the dose, lowering the dose, and different brands, and it's still not working, I would then suggest to not even bother taking it. But for literally 99% of people, splitting the dose, lowering the dose, having it with food will cover the bases around GI tract distress. That's the only real major issue. There is a conversation around water retention. Some people say it causes bloating. I'd say it can cause some GI tract distress, which can make people feel bloated during that loading phase. But there's not true water retention because it's known that creatine does create water retention, but that water retention is intracellular. You're not going to experience that. That's not like adipose tissue water retention. That's in your muscle cells. You're not going to know that. Your muscles might feel fuller in their body, but you're not going to have like softer skin and a more noticeable increase in water retention on the adipose tissue. I know some people say they have experienced that. It kind of goes against the mechanisms of where the water is held in the body. So I think sometimes that's because people have heard it might happen. They're sort of looking out for it because it doesn't actually match up with what's actually happening with the supplement. And like I say, this supplement is so well researched. We understand mechanistically what it does. But yeah, it definitely could make someone have some gas and some bloating. I mentioned creatine kinase and kidney issues. This one bubbles around a little bit. Ultimately, if you have no pre-existing history of issues with kidney damage, then it's absolutely fine to use. There's no research that says it's negative. It really is that link between creatine kinase, the enzyme that's actually needed to speed up the ATP regeneration, which is why creatine kinase scores will be elevated in people that take creatine when they do their blood work. But that does not equal, if someone's not working out, not taking creatine, and creatine kinase is up, that's a big, big difference between someone taking creatine and working out. And if you ever get blood work done and they're looking at liver panels, then you would literally need to, kidney panels, then you'd have to tell them you're taking creatine, otherwise it would flag. The other one is hair loss. There was one study. It's really interesting to see how in some realms in this industry, research can come out and be a slam dunk on just completely obliterating a belief and it never ever gets found out. But one small piece of research that was poorly done and was never been able to be replicated can seem to sort of stick around for so long. And the hair loss one is one of those. It's been shown in one research paper to increase DHT levels, the potent androgen linked to hair loss. Within that study, that was actually with men who were already predisposed to male pattern baldness. It's not been demonstrated in backup research, so it's not something to worry about overall. Just a few final things. Creatine is not a steroid because I've been asked that recently. Like I mentioned, it's not bad for your kidneys. It's probably, you could get bloating, but we can manage that. You don't need to cycle on and off of creatine. It's safe to take all year round. You haven't got to worry about habitual use of it. Final takeaway. So I guess, should you take creatine? Absolutely, 100%. If you're engaged in exercise, you like training hard, and you're covering all your bases around, actually, this is probably a good one to come in on. Creatine, like I mentioned, 2 to 5% increase in performance is great. A good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep is going to affect performance more. Dehydration will affect performance more, and undernourishing yourself for workouts will affect performance more. So I would say you generally want to make sure you're sleeping pretty well. You want to make sure you're probably on top of your hydration levels, and you probably want to be thinking about your pre-workout nutrition prior to thinking about supplementation with creatine. It's a great one to add on to the top when your sleep, hydration, nutrition haven't got to be bang on point, but I've certainly spoken to quite a few people over the course of the last year or 2 years as creatine is getting more and more important, or more and more press. And I've sort of said, like, I don't really think for where you're at in your stage and your journey that creatine is the right thing for you right now. I'd look at those other ones because they're bigger rocks overall. But if you've got those elements in place, 100%, it's effective, it's safe. There is no research, there's no supplement that is researched as heavily as creatine. We can say it's proven. We know exactly what it does. You can't really say proven about many other things in this industry as a whole. Creatine is one of those amazing things that we can. If you're a woman or older adult, or for women going through menopause, older adult, I think it's a really great thing to add to your supplements that you're taking. Potentially for anyone thinking about brain health, it could be advisable to, as I mentioned, 3 to 5 grams per day. Just making sure you're taking it. Doesn't really matter when you take it. And ultimately, to wrap up, to finish up, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you tried creatine? Have you noticed the benefits? I always like to get your feedback and hear from listeners for exactly what you have found when it comes to the topic of the podcast. So for today, creatine supplementation.